Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story, The Forest Guardians. Forest Guardians are otherworldly beings that, as their name suggests, guard forests from harm and destruction. They keep forests safe and clean for those who bear no ill will to nature to enjoy. They are harmless to humans who leave nothing but footprints and take only photographs. My uncle would tell this story during every camping trip. I was 12 years old when I asked him what the forest guardians did to those who didn't treat the nature around them with respect, like we did. Well, he started, they may be mostly harmless to people like us, but to those who take it upon themselves to try and ruin the forest, there is no holding back. They're never seen or heard from again. Another missing person for the notice board. I went to bed that night under the stars beside the very carefully built fireplace surrounded by rocks, covered in sand to quench the flames before we took it apart in the morning, wondering just how bad something referred to as a guardian could be. My uncle got very sick a couple of years later, and the cancer that went undetected for so long took his life a short time later. Before he died, I sat by his bed, and we had a broken conversation about memories of camping, fishing, and hiking. Don't forget the forest guardians. Look after the forest, and the guardians will look after you. Look for their signs. His voice wasn't anything more than a whisper. We moved later that year when my mom got a new job that took us to the city, and it wasn't until I was an adult in my 20s that I had an opportunity to go camping again. I jumped at the chance when a couple of my friends from environmental studies invited me along at the end of the semester. The Friday that we traveled to our local national forest, I had relayed my uncle's story of forest guardians. They had found it interesting, but nothing more than a childhood camping story at best, even going as far as theorizing it was just a way to instill respect for nature in me from a young age, and that it had done a good job. The rest of the car ride was spent talking about us finally being able to let loose and relax, drink beer and smoke weed. The hike up to where we would set up our tents was slower than my friends would have liked. I was taking photographs and rubbings, notes on leaves and flowers. I regaled them with facts about bark types and root systems, but they just wanted to get to our camp spot. Alex had picked the camping spot because of the open clearing, giving us a perfect view of the night sky. It was off trail by about half of a mile, and this made me nervous. My uncle had always told me to stick to the trail because they were there for a reason. To guide you and keep you safe from harm. They'll always lead you to safety. Despite my trepidation, I followed Alex and Olivia through thick foliage as he guided us by map and compass away from the trail and into the deep forest. I tried my best to keep track of where we were by noting rock formations or fallen trees, a crop of brightly colored flowers, but by the time we arrived at the clearing I had little to no idea where we were or how to get back without help. The clearing itself set my gut on edge. It was too clear and open. There was a circle of medium-sized rocks of various shapes to one edge of the large circular opening. Thick trees, bushes and flowers surrounded us on all sides, and there was a large wild thicket of a thorny plant I wasn't familiar with along one full side of the circle. Alex led us into the middle of the clearing and dropped his pack to the floor with a loud thud before turning to myself and Olivia. "Didn't I tell you this would be worth it?" His voice echoed around us through the clearing, making us stop and look towards the tree line. Our eyes followed all the way around until we met each other's gazes. Alex laughs and starts unpacking while Olivia sets about finding sticks for a fire later. Don't forget we need rocks too, to surround the fire and stop it spreading. I remind her and am met with an eye roll which irks me into a scowl. I just don't want to take any chances of the fire spreading. I don't catch her reaction as I make a dirt mound for the twigs and leaves to sit on and another mound to put out the fire before we settle in for the night. Nobody had wanted to hike with a bucket of sand, so I remembered my uncle telling me that in a pinch damp dirt will do just as good a job. By the time we had set up our tents, the light was fading and the campfire was lit. Olivia had made it larger than I was comfortable with and had lit it before I could say anything, but I had the distinct feeling that my words wouldn't have made a difference to her. As I leant back on my pack and relaxed, the conversation switched to why we chose our subjects. It was a no-brainer for me. I care about the environment and the impact humans have on it, for better and worse. I want to be able to make a positive difference to it. I smile proudly and look between Alex and Olivia, who snort laughter. I needed an easy subject to count towards credits. ES was the way to go. I've hardly done any work, and still I'm expected to pass. Alex finished his second beer. Same for me. I was told the professor was a pushover as long as you did the assignments. I talked to my brother, who did the same course last year, about them, and then write out what he'd said while padding it out. I always got straight CS for them, so my parents were happy, and so was the professor. Olivia nodded and held up her bottle in a cheers motion before finishing it and throwing it to the pile. I stared into the flames and chewed on my lip, realizing I had never known my two friends the way I thought I had. If you never really had any interest, why were you so passionate in the debates? I finally spoke after a few minutes. Alex shrugged and opened beer number 3. I want to go into management, and you need to be good at pushing your ideas and standing your ground. It was good practice. I was the best student in my theater class for a reason. I know how to act, Olivia responded coldly. Oh, I said sadly, my eyes downcast. I guess I had hoped more people cared as much as I did about our environment and what we're doing to it. Neither Alex nor Olivia knew how to respond to this comment, and instead decided to pull out a baggie of enough weed for a football team to have a good party. Don't get me wrong. I'm not some prudish, anti-drug, anti-fun person. I've smoked weed and decided it wasn't for me, but would never stop someone else from enjoying themselves. I'd just never seen that much weed before, and was astounded when Alex said it will be gone by the end of our long weekend, while Olivia cheered. No ends on the floor. It all goes into the fire to be burned. I spoke up. The solution wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. You really believe in those forest guardians, don't you? Olivia snorted. I have no reason not to, and it doesn't do any harm. I'd rather just be mindful that we don't leave a mess behind, is all. I shook my head as Alex offered me another beer, motioning I hadn't finished my first. But really? Some supernatural beings who look after the forests? Is there more than one? Olivia continued. Of course. Each forest has its own guardians, and the size of the forest dictates how many guardians are needed. So what? They're watching us now. Olivia laughs and looks around. Oh, great forest guardians. She stands. Please forgive us for our weed use and any other transgressions. She turns on the spot and holds out her arms while speaking loudly. We mean no harm to you or your forest. She falls down onto her butt, laughing. I'm sorry, I couldn't keep a straight face. She continues to laugh. You know you can be a real asshole.
Ich snapped her.
What's the point in mocking them? Oh, cool it, Alex pipes up. It's not like they're actually real. What makes you so sure? I retorted. Have you ever seen one of them? Alex shrugged. If you see them, you're the one in trouble. I answer simply and finish my beer and sigh. I'm turning in. There's been a lot of walking today. Don't forget to put out the fire, please. I shuffle towards my tent and take off my hiking boots, leaving them by the entrance before zipping up and laying on my sleeping bag. I spent an hour or so listening to hushed whispers about me, and my weird paranoid quirks while trying not to cry. I awoke before dawn on Saturday and needed the bathroom badly. Luckily, I had come prepared with bamboo toilet paper, which was much better for the environment. Slipping on my boots and unzipping my tent, I was disappointed to find the fire dying but still burning. Checking my watch, I sighed. It had been going all night, and there was no sign that Olivia or Alex had even tried to put it out. I walk over and do the job myself, making sure the dirt was damp enough to work by adding some more water to it. It wasn't until I stood that I realized the 2 tents and packs were missing, but the trash pile was still by the fire pit. Olivia? Alex? I called into the lifting darkness and waited for an answer that never came. When did they leave? Why did they leave? Hello? I call out again and hear a twig break in the distance. My need to use the bathroom was quickly forgotten as I bagged up the trash into my pack and took down my tent. As I took apart joining poles, I came across a wreath hanging from one of them. It was made of unidentifiable leaves, foliage, and flowers. Even my torchlight didn't help me with what it was made of. But there was no question of who or what left it for me. Look out for their signs, my uncle had said, and I had asked what he meant. They protect those who protect them, and they leave gifts to those who need protecting or are no harm. I had asked what kind of gifts would forest guardians leave someone. Twig statues, odd-looking rocks, foliage, and berry wreaths. Wreaths are special. It means they consider you a friend. I nodded and stroked his hand, telling him to rest now, that he had taught me well. I stayed until the end, secretly hoping he would wake and tell me more. Just one last conversation. One last story. I attached the wreath to my pack and shouldered it with the help of one of the rocks from the formation. Once it was seated comfortably, I looked around for both the sunrise and positioning of everything around me. It meant I could roughly work out where I needed to go to get back. Once I had found my entry point, I started on my way back, quickly noticing broken branches, twisted hedges, bushes, and pulled flowers. I followed the trail of destruction, hoping it would lead me to Alex and Olivia, and I could find out what was going on. As I continued along this seemingly marked for me route, I started finding items of clothing that I recognized as Olivia's. What had they done? Where had they gone? Why had they done this? I collected the discarded clothing and trash as I walked, packing it away into my bag as I went. As I neared a small clearing, I took in the eerie scene. Even though my watch said it was very clearly after sunrise, there was no sun getting to the clearing. There was a low ground fog that clung to my ankles and feet, making them cold. Ahead of me was a stone structure that appeared to be of ceremonial use. There were carved figures either side. I stepped closer and realized they were made of individual bones that had been secured together. Bones of what? I couldn't tell, but I silently hoped they were animals. Carved into the torso of the figures was a simple line symbol which was strangely familiar. If you really piss off the guardians, you'll be marked with a symbol. My uncle had told me while barbecuing. My mother had huffed and protested about his stories, but he had ignored her and continued. It's 3 lines, 6 dots, an old Nordic sign called Thuriaz. It is referring to Thurs, who was a Nordic giant of an evil being. People used to associate the forest guardians as evil and bad when they were just protecting, and so to ward them off they would use this symbol. Over time the guardians started using it themselves. I heard a low, undulating growl to my right and snapped my head to see what it was. A dark, tall shadow walked into the forest. It was at least 7 feet tall with extra long arms that ended in hooks which touched the ground. Their figure was sinewy and skeletal, as if trying to be human in form but couldn't quite get it right. The hooks looked as though freshly sharpened and made of bone, protruding from the mid-arm area. The feet were in proportion to the rest of the body, but but the toes were long and thin with claw-like nails which dug into the earth as it took each step, leaving a strange footprint in its wake. The figure stopped and looked at me. The face was a blank slate with only indents where eyes, nose, and mouth should be. The head tilted, and then it turned to walk through a stone archway. I got the feeling I was being instructed to follow, and as such, I did. I kept a safe distance behind the creature and felt no fear towards it as I felt no malice towards myself. It simply led me down a hidden trail to another clearing where I saw my friends hung from 2 wooden frames. 2 stone brazier-type structures were ablaze beside the frames, and directly in front was a large dugout pit that I couldn't see in. More figures like the one that led me here were hidden in the tree lines all around us. Olivia looked over at me and screamed for help. She was naked and covered in cuts as if she had been dragged through the underbrush. Her hair was knotted and dirty with mud and sticks. Carved into her stomach and dripping blood was the same symbol from the bone figures. I looked on, taking in everything else, and my eyes came to rest on Alex, who was also naked, dirty and bloody. The symbol was cut into the top of his thigh. He made no noise, and I noted the blood down his chin and chest. "Please, help us," Olivia called out, and her following scream echoed around the silent space as if it couldn't escape into the trees. Like we were all in a bubble that closed us off from the rest of the world. I tried to speak, but nothing came from my mouth except a croak. I had so many questions to ask, but couldn't speak them at all. My vocal cords wouldn't cooperate, and instead I closed my mouth and just watched. The creatures seemed to communicate in grunts and growls, low rumbles that I felt more than heard. Their hooks gesticulated towards me, and then Olivia and Alex, before I felt the wreath, popped from my bag and held up behind me. I turned my head and saw a much taller creature holding it high before rumbling so low I could only feel it. The others looked at the wreath, which was then placed on my head. They bowed their own heads and turned attention back to my friends. "Oh God, please. Please help." Olivia was sobbing my name and begging, but I didn't want to help her or Alex. My feet were firmly planted to the floor, and even if I did want to help, I couldn't move. Alex lifted his head and let out a keening, wailing noise. Blood seeped from between his lips and poured down his chest when he opened his mouth to reveal the missing tongue. I didn't wince or turn away. I didn't feel sick. I understood. These creatures were the forest guardians. These beings were keeping the forest safe from those who didn't respect it. My uncle never told me what happened to those who were caught by the guardians. He would go silent and shake his head before changing the subject, and now as I watched the guardians moving, I understood why. They started with Alex. A hook held up his face from under his chin, moved his face from side to side. I could see the fear in Alex's eyes as another guardian stepped behind him and cut him open down his spine. I didn't need to see what they were doing to know what was happening. The cuts were precise and slow to prolong suffering. His grunts and cries of agony were muffled by the tree line as he was painstakingly skinned alive. He was passed out before they had finished his arms, and I dare say dead, before that had completed his torso. I hoped he was dead. Olivia screamed while watching the skinning because she knew she was next. The skin was held up in triumph before her and laid on a stone slab that I hadn't noticed before. It was similar to the first I had seen in the previous clearing, and I wondered if it was an altar of some sort used by the guardians for offerings. Next, they removed fat, muscle, sinew, all internal organs until they had only his bones. They picked out the largest bones, considered their shapes and dimensions before discarding what they didn't want in the pit. Olivia was hyperventilating, and her screams had become rough from the damage she had done to her vocal cords. I was mesmerized by what was happening in front of me, I was disgusted and amazed and proud and angry all at the same time. But I understood it needed to happen. The process was repeated on Olivia, and I had an errant thought about what had caused them to cut out Alex's tongue. I wonder if he had run his mouth, as if he could have stopped any of this by doing so. These beings are as old as time. None of his words would ever strike fear into them. They had seen it all, feared nothing, and survived. They would continue to survive. By the time I had come out of my thoughts, Olivia had either passed out from shock or died. Her screams had fallen silent, and there was only the sound of skin being cut and removed. They repeated the full process on her, and again discarded the bones they didn't want into the pit. The guardians disappeared into the forest tree line, and I was alone. The spell was broken. The bubble popped, and the sun was shining onto the altar. Birds started to sing, and I waved my hand in front of me as insects buzzed about. I turned and began to walk. I didn't know where I was supposed to walk, but I followed the cracking of twigs until they led me to a flowing river, and I realized I hadn't had any water in hours. My watch showed me it was after midday, and I knelt by the water to drink from my cupped hands. After only a few moments listening to the water and the wildlife, I again stood and started walking, following the sounds of more breaking twigs, rustling bushes, and low rumbles until I was on a marked trail with signs pointing in various directions. Before starting towards the car park, I turned in the direction I believed the guardian was hiding. "Thank you." Something was thrown at my feet, and I looked around the floor to see a pebble. I picked it up and realized it wasn't a pebble. It was a cut piece of bone with a symbol carved onto both sides. 3 lines that looked like half a tree. I learned later this was Fehu, another Norse rune that is considered lucky and a symbol of hope. I don't remember how long I walked down the trail and reached a ranger outpost. I didn't tell them everything, but I did tell them my friends had gone missing. I was asked a barrage of questions, and I answered them to the best of my ability. When the older man, who looked like had seen far more than he would ever admit, said, "We can't promise anything with this forest, but we'll have a look," I understood he knew what I had seen. He held my eyes for longer than needed to make sure that I did understand. I nodded and thanked them, told them if they needed anything, here were my details. They took them, and we went through the motions as if they would make any difference. "Nice wreath you have there," the older man said. I reached up and took it off to look at it. "I didn't realize it was there." I lied. He nodded again and told me quietly it would be best if I went with the officers when they arrived and tried to forget. I kept this to myself for 15 years, and now as my own children are interested in camping, a whole new cycle starts, and I have more people to teach. If you look after the forest, the guardians will look after you. Second story. Don't go into the forest after sundown. My husband and I live in a house that's somewhat secluded. Our neighbors aren't the type you can just say hi to over the fence, and a large, thick forest backs our property. For the past year that we have lived here, I have gone on a run along the forest path almost every morning. My husband likes to sleep in, whereas I've always enjoyed my early rises. Last week, we went to a friend's birthday party and were out late. I ended up sleeping in and missing my morning run. I had a few chores to do, and by the time 5 p.m. rolled around, I decided I wasn't going to miss my run that day. I stepped out onto the back porch and took a deep breath as the sun was beginning to set on the horizon. My husband stepped out and gave me a lazy smile before he kissed me on the cheek. I told him I'd be back before it was dark and headed off. It started off like any other run. I take the same path each day. It's a little overgrown, but still obvious enough and easy to follow. I was only about 10 minutes in, and I started to notice something. It was quiet, eerily quiet. Normally I can hear birds, leaves in the breeze, and bugs chirping. but it was just complete silence apart from my own breathing and heart beating in my chest. I found it creepy, but shrugged it off as something to do with the timing of the day. The next strange thing happened only a few minutes later. There's a part of the path that wraps around this massive gum tree, the type that you can't see around when you stand in front of it. Well, I reached that part of the path and it was gone. Completely gone. Not like someone chopped it down and there was a stump or a hole in the ground left. It was like the tree never existed in the first place. There was grass and fallen leaves in its place. It looked like any other part of the forest floor, untouched for years. I was starting to get a bit freaked out. I run this path every day. I know this tree is meant to be here. I remember the first time I saw it. I was in awe at the size. I made my husband come for a walk with me the next day so I could show him too, and he was also impressed by the sheer scale of it. It didn't make any sense that it had quite literally vanished. Even if someone was going to chop it down, I wondered if it was even possible to do it in such a short amount of time. I only just saw it the day before on my usual morning run. The practical, logistic part of my mind came to the conclusion it must have been chopped down. I decided I would wait to talk to my husband about it when I got back and maybe even bring him with me to have a look the next day. Maybe he would have an obvious answer that I was missing. Perhaps I could contact the council and ask them about it. I shook it off and continued along the path. As I continued running, I started to get this off feeling in my stomach. Something just didn't feel right, but I didn't know what it was. After a while, I noticed that the sun was setting. Fast. I was losing light quickly, which didn't make any sense. I only left at 5 p.m. The sun wasn't due to set until almost 7, and I had only been gone about 20 minutes. I looked at my watch and sure enough, 5:23 p.m. I checked my phone and it said the same. Just to be sure, I opened up the weather app and checked the sunset, 6:46 p.m. I was standing in almost darkness staring at my phone in total confusion. I had no idea what was going on and it was scaring the crap out of me. I knew the trees would make it dimmer than out in the open, but this was different. I decided enough was enough, and I was just going to cut my run short and head home. I turned around and began running back the way I came. After about another 10 minutes of running, I was stopped in my tracks and I felt my heart almost stop. There, standing on the path staring directly at me was a moose. Those things are insanely huge. But the weirdest part about it all was I live in Australia. We have just about every deadly animal on the planet, but we sure as hell don't have moose wandering around, and I certainly had never seen one in the last year I had been coming through the forest. I stared at this creature for what felt like an eternity, my heartbeat pounding in my head as my mind raced. It just stood there, eyes glowing in the dark, staring into my soul. I was frozen in fear, unsure of what I should do. Then, after I felt like I was going to throw up from fear, it finally broke eye contact and just walked away. I stared as it strolled out of sight as if nothing had happened. Once I could no longer hear the footsteps, and I was back in complete silence, I began sprinting. I was way too terrified to be in this forest a second longer than I had to be. I ran and ran until my lungs felt like they were going to give out. I thought for sure I should be reaching the clearing soon, but the more I ran, the more it felt like I went deeper and deeper into the woods. I glanced at my watch and my breath hitched. 9:42 p.m. It's not possible, I said to myself. It can't have been 4 hours. My whole interaction with the moose, although felt like forever, in reality only lasted a few minutes. I pulled out my phone, and again it matched what my watch said. I tried to call my husband, but I couldn't get any service. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. It was pitch black now, and I had to use my phone torch to illuminate the path. My mind was racing with some kind of way to come up with how this could be happening, but I had nothing. I decided all I could do was keep following the path, and hoped that soon enough I would come out and be home. I was exhausted from running for so long, so I walked for a while, constantly checking my phone to see if I got any reception to try and call somebody. I knew that I should have been out of the forest by now. I was trying my best to stay calm, but I was panicking internally. Suddenly I froze with fear when I heard a deafening, guttural scream in the distance. I had never felt so sick in the stomach. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like I was about to pass out. It was unlike anything I had ever heard. It didn't sound human, but I couldn't think of any kind of animal that makes that noise either. I turned the flash off my phone. For some reason, standing in complete darkness felt safer to me at that moment. I didn't dare move as I intently listened for any more noise. Not a sound, not even a cricket or a breeze. The scream came from behind, and so I decided all I could do was keep moving and hopefully get further away. I'd heard online that mountain lions make terrifying screaming noises, but again, to the best of my knowledge, there are none in Australia, and certainly not in my area. Either way, I was not interested in finding out, so I picked up my pace as I continued down the never-ending path. Then, I heard it again. Only this time it was much louder, meaning only one thing. It was getting closer. I broke into a full sprint, the adrenaline burst giving me the extra energy I didn't know I had. I ran for as long as I physically could before I had to slow down to catch my breath. I glanced at my watch again, 1:05 a.m. I let out a short laugh in disbelief. I closed my eyes and rubbed my temples as I took a few deep breaths. I was too afraid to stay still, so I began walking again. The forest felt never-ending. There was no sign of a clearing or anything that looked familiar. No matter how much I moved, I just seemed to go deeper and deeper into the thick woods. I no longer even had a path. I was stepping over branches and bushes, trying my best not to trip. I was watching the ground for so long, I forgot to look ahead of me, and when I did, that was when I saw him. Or rather, standing just a few meters from me. I could make out the figure of a pale person with their back facing me. I should have been thrilled to see another person, but for some reason their presence irked me, and right before I was about to blurt out something, I stopped myself. It was hard to make out many details in the dark. My eyes had somewhat adjusted, but from what I could see, he was just standing there, facing the other way, seemingly doing nothing. He looked bald, and I struggled to make out any clothes on his body. As I was studying him, that's when it happened. His head slowly turned until it was facing me. My breathing stopped when I saw its face. Instead of human eyes, it had two large black circles that looked like mini abysses. It had no nose and a mouth that matched its empty eyes. When I didn't think it could get more terrifying, the creature slowly began to stand, and I realized it was actually squatting initially. I watched in frozen terror as the creature's long, skinny legs came into view, right as it dropped its freakishly long, skinny arms at the same time. It must have been more than 10 feet tall. Once the creature had fully stood up, it turned towards me. I was too scared to move, to think, to breathe. All I could do was watch. It stared at me for a moment before dropping its jaw to let out the most unearthly, thunderous roar you could imagine. This was enough to snap me out of my frozen state of terror. I turned on my heel and sprinted in the opposite direction of the creature. My chest was burning as I ran as fast as I could. I refused to look behind me, but I could hear the thumping legs following behind me. I had no sense of direction, no plan. All I could do was run. I still couldn't see that well, and so I hadn't seen the edge until it was too late, rolling and toppling down a steep hill until I landed in the thick brush at the bottom. I groaned in pain, winded from the fall. I blinked a few times before looking up at the ledge I had just fallen from, where the creature suddenly appeared. My eyes widened and my heart raced as it looked around. I thought for sure this was it. There's no chance I can outrun this thing in my state. Just as I was reflecting on all the things in life I had missed out on, the creature turned away and walked back into the trees, out of sight. I let out the breath I didn't realize I was holding on to. The bushes must have swallowed me up enough so that it didn't see me. I checked my watch again. 4:59 a.m. After laying there for a few minutes to catch my breath, I slowly sat up, wiping the tears from my eyes as I could finally think for a moment. When I felt ready enough, I rose to my feet and looked around. I then noticed the path, a very familiar path. It was the one I ran every day. I began following it, hoping and praying with every step that my ordeal would finally be over. After a while, the forest started getting thinner, trees more spaced out, until finally I could see a clearing with light. I audibly gasped as I quickened my pace into a full sprint towards the opening, and when I came out on the other side, I could see the sunrise. Tears filled my eyes as I saw my house in the distance, and I continued running until I got to the back door. I burst into the house and saw my husband sitting in the living room with a mug in his hand. He turned and gave me a puzzled look when he saw me. "You all right?" he asked. I stared at him in disbelief. Why was he not more concerned? Why hadn't he been out looking for me? "Are you joking? I've been gone all night. I got lost and so many crazy things happened. The time went all weird and dash." "All night? What are you talking about? You were gone for like 20 minutes. He responded, totally bewildered by my shouting. "But the sun is rising. I just saw it when I was coming back," I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. "No, that's the sunset." He rose and came over to me, concern on his face. He pulled out his phone and pointed at the lock screen. "Look, 5:24 p.m. You were gone for less than half an hour." Third story, The Witchwood Wendigo. Evening came quickly. They left home just past noon, but those 8 hours seemed like nothing. Jeremy and Janessa Atwood were alone in the vast Venetia forest. It was the plan to camp out for a few nights, and they had most of the necessary supplies. They'd taken a cab to the start of the forest just outside the border of Witchwood. Had their parents even noticed? "You think you can get this started?" Janessa asked after consistently failing to light the fire. Rubbing 2 sticks together simply wasn't getting the job done. Jeremy walked over, placed some kindling around the larger pieces of wood along with some leaves. He pulled out a lighter that he'd swiped from his parents' room just before they left. "Technology. Sometimes it's useful," smirked Jeremy. "Why didn't you just hand it to me 10 minutes ago?" Janessa groaned. At 16, the Atwood siblings were twins. They shared the same brown hair, though Janessa's reached breast level. His eyes were green, while hers were gray. At 5'4", Janessa stopped growing a year ago, while Jeremy was hoping to add another inch to his current 5'8" stature before adulthood. Jeremy pulled out the necessary ingredients for s'mores. "We should probably consider eating an actual dinner," suggested Janessa. "We can shoot a rabbit tomorrow," joked Jeremy. "Come on, you were supposed to bring actual food along." Jeremy sighed and headed over to his high school backpack. Rummaging through for a moment, he pulled out a small pot and a couple of cans of chunky soup. "One of us is gonna have to hold the pot above the fire. Also, we don't have any bowls." Are you serious? We were kind of in a rush, remember? I just wanted to be out of there ASAP. Janessa grabbed one of the soup cans and peeled it open. "Yeah, same here. Shit, this was supposed to be a family trip." They poured the cans into the pot and Jeremy held it over the growing fire. They were surrounded by trees, but none close enough to risk a forest fire. They'd made a point of setting up a fire in a slightly barren section of the forest. The tent was set up nearby. It was large enough for 4 adults, so the twins would have plenty of space that night. You want to give it a try? There are a couple of spoons in my backpack. Janessa took one out and dipped it into the soup. There was a bit of steam coming for the single curly noodle she picked out. She blew on it once before slipping the spoon into her mouth. Good enough for me, she said. Great. Jeremy set the pot down on a slightly slanted rock he'd carried to their campsite about an hour earlier. They ate from the pot as the fire died down slightly. Jeremy placed some more kindling and returned to finishing off the pot. There was still plenty of liquid, which they poured just outside the campsite. Ready for some s'mores? Asked Jeremy. Nah, I'm pretty full, she replied, brushing off the rock where they just ate and taking a seat. Jeremy had grabbed some chopsticks from the kitchen drawer earlier, which he used to cook a couple of marshmallows. They were slightly blackened on the edges when he slipped them between some graham crackers and chocolate. Janessa looked up in the dark blue sky while her brother ate. A few stars were poking out finally. They were half an hour deep into the forest, with the nearest road an additional half hour from Witchwood city limits. Janessa decided to pull out a couple of marshmallows and make her own s'more. Unlike her brother, she didn't mind keeping the marshmallows as is. The chocolate was decent, but it didn't taste as good as she'd hoped. Nevertheless, it was nice to just have some peace and quiet. Afterwards, they cleaned up and put the supplies back in Jeremy's backpack. They sat together around the fire, occasionally adding another log or just kindling. So, have any ghost stories? Asked Jeremy. Not a ghost story. I was thinking a bit about the alleged Wendigo that supposedly lurks around here. Yeah, it's weird that they call it the Witchwood Wendigo, even though this is the Venetia Forest, replied Jeremy. It just sounded catchier, shrugged Janessa. Also, aren't they usually located further up north? I think I heard they're supposed to hang around the Great Lake area and the coast. We're a bit off from that down here. They're just myths. You think people would actually camp out here if there were actual cases of people being eaten by some large emaciated creature? Fair point. Then again, how do we know people just haven't been eaten in this forest? We'd have probably heard about a few missing person reports by now. Maybe even some body parts would have been uncovered. It's just fun to speculate. Kinda scary to think about. I guess that's the same as telling ghost stories. Feeling spooked yet? Nah. Janessa shook her head. I feel a lot better than I did earlier. I'm glad we're out here. Yeah, it's good to get away for a bit. I mean, we left a couple of notes out too, so they know we'll be out here another night. There was another minute of silence between them. Janessa looked up at the sky again. Sure enough, there were dozens of stars filling the sky. They lived in one of the more residential regions of Witchwood, where sky was nowhere near as clear as this. It would be cool to go into space one day, said Jeremy. Assuming you can ever get over your fear of heights, teased Janessa. Hey, I can handle heights. At least most of the time. I just don't like being in an observatory 500 feet off of the ground. You're right, it felt pretty weird up there. But that was like 5 years ago. Maybe next time it won't seem so scary. I'm not interested in going back anytime soon. So, still have a thing for Haley Robinson? Nah, kinda lost interest. I don't really have any crushes at the moment. How about you? I think Max is kinda cute. Too bad he's gay. Wait, Max is gay? Nah, but he doesn't really seem to care about girls or anything. He seems pretty asexual. Probably has something to do with those bitches back at his old middle school. What bitches? I haven't told you? Max used to get bullied by these couple of girls named Tess and Kimberly. Apparently it got pretty bad, and that's why he transferred down here. Wow, I had no idea. A big guy like him. I didn't think anyone would try to pick around on. He's kinda shy though. That sucks. Chances are karma will come after them one day. I'm sure of it. There was another silence between the siblings. Jeremy joined his sister in looking up at the stars. She was right. It really was more relaxing out here. Aside from visiting some relatives up in Kentucky, neither of them had been out of Witchwood in close to a year. Spring break was spent around town with friends, while winter break was spent stocking up on groceries just before a surprising blanket of snow. That didn't happen too often in the state of Sanowi. Though it wasn't the deep south, it was southern enough for milder winters and scorching summers. Earlier that day, it went up to 93. Even with the sun down, it was still 80 degrees and quite humid. "One more year before we're out of here," said Janessa. "Still thinking of heading off to college?" "Probably. West Sanowi State isn't an arm and a leg. Plus, I'd get to be in a big city for once." "What about you? Still want to be a detective?" "I might try and get an associate's degree or something to look slightly more qualified. I know a lot of detectives used to be cops, but I'm not sure I want to take that route. You don't need licensing to be a private eye in this state anyway, so my path is reasonably open. We both kinda have that in common. You want to be a detective too?"
No.
"I mean, we both want to help people. I'd rather focus on high school kids. I've been keeping a journal for like a year now. I want to look back in 10 years and try to remember what it was like being a high school girl. It might help me relate better to students. It's still weird you actually want to be a high school counselor. I guess we're just unusual kids. Remember when Mom and Dad wouldn't shut up to people about how both of us were left-handed? It's better than being in matching outfits like we had back in kindergarten. I wonder how many other twins had to put up with having their childhoods defined by it. Yeah, at least we get along most of the time. It's cool being out here and all. I just kinda wish we didn't feel like we had to rush off. If they worry about us, maybe that'll teach them a lesson? I don't like looking at it that way." Janessa stared sadly at the fire. "Hey, tomorrow's gonna be a good day. We'll head down to the river, skip some stones, and maybe try and catch some fish with our bare hands. Sound fun?" "Yeah." They smiled at one another. The fire died down about an hour later. It was still relatively early, but already they were tired. Before setting up camp, they'd walked around the forest for a while. Since school ended a few weeks back, neither of them had gotten much physical activity. It was close to 10 when they finally headed into the tent with a couple of push-button night lights. They slipped under their sleeping bags with a couple of small pillows and put the lights out. There were crickets chirping and an owl hooting off in the distance. It was peaceful out there. The sounds acted as a lullaby as they twins fell asleep within minutes. Damn it. It was right around sunrise when Janessa awoke to a mild pain in her stomach. She sat up and looked around. That's right. She was out camping with her brother. No bathroom within walking distance either. She moved slowly out of the tent and opened her brother's backpack. "Awesome," whispered Janessa. Jeremy had the sense to pack a roll of toilet paper. It was light out, though the ground was still almost entirely in shade. A few early rays of light appeared somewhat distant. She looked around for an area more dense with trees and headed over. About 7 minutes later, she headed back with the toilet paper roll in her left hand. "Ugh, I really hope he packed hand sanitizer," she muttered. Just then she noticed movement by a tree a few meters to her left. She turned, certain she'd seen some large animal. It seemed as though it was walking upright. No way. What could it have been? Shrugging it off, she headed back to the tent. To her surprise, Jeremy was sitting by the now extinguished campfire. "I have this in case you need it," she said, holding up the toilet paper. Jeremy didn't reply. As she neared him, he turned away from her. His hair was a bit of a mess and looked longer than she'd remembered. "What's wrong?" Janessa tried to get a look at his face, but again he turned away. She walked around, but he kept moving away. Eventually, she started jogging around, yet he was somehow fast enough to keep avoiding her. Jeremy, what the hell? She stopped after running around him 5 times. Are you mad at me or something? Seriously, why aren't you talking to me? There was some movement back in the tent. Janessa looked over, dropping the toilet paper when she saw what was inside. Hey, I just woke up. How's it going? What the fuck? Janessa took a few steps back. Jeremy gave her a funny look. She kept her eyes on him, while pointing to the person who looked and was dressed just like Jeremy. Jeremy looked where she was pointing. Whoa, who's this guy? Jeremy stepped out of the tent, slipping his shoes on. Janessa kept her distance from both of them. Good morning, said Jeremy politely. Janessa noticed him pull out a switchblade. You mind telling us what you're doing outside our tent? The figure stood up. It was significantly taller than Jeremy. Not only was it taller, but its arms were disproportionately long, fingers reaching the ground when it stood at full height. When the figure turned to face them, it still looked like the back of a person's head. There was no sign of a face beneath the hair. Oh shit, said Jeremy as he headed over to his sister.
Smoren.
The twins raced off from the campsite. They tried sticking close together as they ran. They weren't sure if the figure was following them, and they had no intention of looking back. They ran past trees for several minutes before stopping behind one that was tall and hollow. Oh my God, it's real, whispered Janessa. Both of them were trembling and out of breath. Where the hell is the road? Whispered Jeremy, eyes frantically searching the forest. I don't know. Maybe we can find the trail or something. They walked close together, constantly on alert. What the hell was that thing? Asked Jeremy, making fists to minimize the shakiness in his hands. I don't want to find out, replied Janessa. There, I think I see the trail. They walked in the direction where she pointed, quickly finding a trail. There were no signs giving directions, but they followed it carefully, still watching every which way. They walked slowly, despite their minds screaming for them to run, or even fly if possible. They were lost in a forest with what seemed to be a real-life Wendigo. This couldn't possibly be real, could it? About 10 minutes after hitting the trail, they noticed their campsite nearby. We just went in a circle, didn't we? Whispered Jeremy. Maybe we should get our stuff? Suggested Janessa, moving off of the trail slightly. Jeremy clutched her hand tightly. No way. We need to find a way out of here. We should get some stuff. Maybe we can throw it at that thing if it starts chasing us again? Jeremy looked around and let out a long sigh. Shit. I still think this is a bad idea, he grumbled as they headed back to the campsite. Jeremy grabbed his backpack, pulling out the pot from last night. Janessa tapped him on the shoulder and pointed at the tent. It was zipped up again. They exchanged looks and quietly crept away. As they did, the zipper opened. Janessa mouthed something but made no sound. Popping out were a pair of heads. Both had long hair, albeit with bald patches. Their faces were dirty and their skin was an ashy gray. They looked dead. The heads looked around, but didn't seem to notice the twins. Jeremy tugged at Janessa's left hand, and the pair took off running again. They raced back on the trail, running as fast as they could. Up ahead, Jeremy noticed something walking past the trees. Its body was severely emaciated, its long arms accompanied by massive hands and branch-like fingers. Oh shit, whispered Jeremy. He tugged at his sister and pointed in the adjacent direction of the creature. They rushed off of the trail and back into a denser part of the forest. As they ran, they could hear something moving behind them. The sound was getting louder. It was like a large animal stampeding. Jeremy noticed a tall tree with a couple of low-hanging branches. Up here, he cried and lunged for the nearest branch. He pulled himself up first and immediately climbed the second.
Small.
He yelled to his sister, refusing to look back. He must have been 10 feet up when he heard her scream.
No.
Despite the season, there weren't too many leaves on this tree. He stared down and saw Janessa on the ground. Frantically, she flailed her arms around, trying to push something off of her. But there was nothing there. Nothing that could be seen, at least. He almost called out to her again, but fell silent when her shirt ripped. Claw marks appeared with blood spilling out. Janessa screamed again, while Jeremy watched in horror. A couple of seconds later, her right eye was punctured by something. He watched as the eyeball was pulled from the socket. The screams were unbearable, but there was nothing he could do to escape. There was blood on the right side of her face now, as the creature continued to mutilate her. She kept putting up a desperate fight as her left eye was also sucked out of its socket. Jeremy held tightly to the branch at his chest level, unable to look away. The struggles carried on for several more minutes. The girl didn't even look like Janessa anymore. Her eyes were gone, and a significant chunk of the right side of her face had been eaten away. In spite of this, he could still hear gargled screams as she kept flailing about on the ground. Her shirt had been mostly ripped away, leaving a torso covered in blood and innards. How was she still alive? And why couldn't he look away? The screams finally died down, as did Janessa's movements. The whole time Jeremy couldn't see the thing that was attacking her. It was completely invisible. Was it still the Wendigo? He heard movement, as though something large was walking away. He even saw what looked like massive paw prints appear in the ground below. The movement quieted, leaving behind the mutilated, almost unrecognizable corpse of Janessa Atwood. Her throat had been ripped apart, her innards spilling from her torso, those sockets picked clean. No movement, no signs of life. Jeremy hung on for dear life. This couldn't be real. This had to be some sort of nightmare. The ground was spinning, so it had to be a dream. This had to be some sort of nightmare. Why wasn't he waking up? He didn't know how long he stood there, but he'd surely spent the entire morning staring at his sister's corpse. He could never leave. If he tried to get down, that thing would do the exact same thing to him. He was alone in Venetia forest with a corpse and a Wendigo. He'd probably never see his parents again. Janessa certainly wouldn't. And in her current state, they'd probably never see her again either. Hours passed. Jeremy continued to search the forest, listening carefully as ever. There were no further signs of the Wendigo, or whatever the hell that creature was. At this point, he no longer wanted to risk looking down. Janessa's corpse was down there. He didn't want to comfort it anymore. He couldn't. His arms were tired, but it was better than being ripped to pieces. Jeremy.
No.
It couldn't be. From below, Jeremy heard Janessa's voice, but she was dead. Even in the off chance that she was barely alive, she wouldn't last much longer. I can't see you, Jeremy. I can't see anything. Go away, whispered Jeremy. You're dead. You're not real. Go away. There was silence again for another few minutes. Jeremy shut his eyes, resting his head on the branch he was holding. He was so tired, completely drained. Brother, where are you? I can't see anything. His eyes opened, wide and alert. It wasn't real. He had to be hallucinating at this point. I don't want to be stuck like this, Jeremy. Please pull me up. I'm scared all alone down here. Tears spilled from Jeremy's eyes. It must have been guilt. He didn't stop at the first branch. He could have probably helped her up. He could have probably saved her. Then again, maybe both of them would be lying dead on the ground. He tried. Scratching. Something was scratching at the trunk of the tree. "I don't want to be alone down here," said Janessa sadly. "Jeremy, save me." The scratching grew louder. He held to the tree branch tighter than ever. "You're not real," he insisted. "You're just a figment at this point. Now get out of my head." The scratching was accompanied by footsteps and what sounded like talking. "Jeremy, save me." Janessa's scream was like that of a banshee. It was hypnotic. Jeremy found himself looking back down. Janessa's eyeless corpse was standing right by the tree, scratching at it with inhumanly long nails. She was looking up at him, most of her face missing, dirt in her hair. Jeremy screamed, "Help me! Oh God! Somebody! Somebody! I'm losing my mind! Help! Help me! Oh my God, she's dead! My sister's dead! Please don't let me end up like her! Save me! Help me!" Rescue at last. Right as he was screaming, a couple of men happened by. Despite their presence, Jeremy remained in a panicked state. He refused to climb down. Close to an hour later, police arrived at the scene. A balding, middle-aged cop was able to talk Jeremy down from the tree once Janessa's body had been taken away. Once he was back on the ground, he could barely stand. The cop, whose name was Oscar, wasn't a large man, but he had enough strength to carry the traumatized Jeremy in his arms. Not long thereafter, Jeremy's parents arrived. He didn't speak to them at all that night. Once his feet were on the ground, he'd blacked out. He was taken to a hospital for inspection. He sustained no major injuries, though he'd been physically worn down. He ended up sleeping for 14 hours in a hospital bed. Luckily, he didn't have any dreams that night. Despite yesterday's trauma, he claimed not to recall much of anything that happened. He knew Janessa was dead, but he didn't remember anything else. About a week passed and Jeremy was up in his bedroom. He hadn't left since returning home. His parents hadn't been up to see him either. Aside from some brief conversation at the hospital, he hadn't spoken with his parents at all. Apparently, Janessa's funeral happened earlier that day. He heard his parents talking about it that morning, but they decided not to ask him along. He was unsure how he felt about that. The reality is that he didn't want to go. The last thing he remembered was hearing her talk to someone outside the tent that morning. His parents signed him up for therapy, which he'd begin in a few days. Were they going to try and force him to remember what happened? He didn't want to remember. He sat there at the desk in his bedroom, staring blankly at his computer. All he wanted to do was try and move on. But how could he? He hadn't experienced any nightmares in the week since the incident. It surprised him that he had so little recollection of the events of that morning. Though he wanted to forget, he also wanted to understand. What happened to Janessa? Jeremy reached into his closet and pulled out a brown cap. He'd forgotten to wear it on the trip, even though he considered it a top priority right before leaving. It was probably better that he didn't, otherwise he'd associate it with the trauma. He'd gotten rid of the clothing he wore on that day. He really wanted to distance himself from anything he could remind him of that day. He slipped on the brown cap, feeling the edges. It had been a birthday present from Janessa earlier that year. He felt the need to turn it backwards. It was a change in style that felt right. At the moment, a map of Venetia County was displayed on his computer. He looked at the section labeled as forest. He placed his finger on the screen, causing it to move slightly. "I'll remember eventually," he whispered, eyes unable to look away from the screen. "I want to know what happened to you. I just don't want to find out today." Fourth story. The story of my fourth great-grandfather in the American Revolutionary War. My fourth great-grandfather served in the American Revolutionary War from 1777 to his discharge in 1778. He was a militia, meaning he has to defend local towns from British forces. Me and my grandfather were scavenging our stuff that we hadn't used for a while. We went to our ancestor's house in Massachusetts, my fourth great-grandfather, to drink beer and talk about friends and family. It was a nice house. There was a fireplace and a casement window. After our talk, my grandfather got up and went into a room, returned with a small book which looked like a diary, and I was correct. My grandfather said with a calm tone, "You know, your dad doesn't like to talk about this because he thinks that you will stay up night every day. If you don't know what's this book, then it's your fourth great-grandfather's journal during the war." It was 12 a.m. right now. It scared me a little bit. My grandfather read the whole entire journal, and after that, I have no words. We just said goodbye and went to our homes, and I couldn't get some sleep after that story my grandfather read. The following is my fourth great-grandfather journal. November 13th, 1777. I have been enlisted in the Continental Army. I was a youth when I entered into the service of the military. My elder brother hath perished in the Battle of Saratoga. My friend, William, and myself were dispatched to a hamlet in Upper State New York, a community of roughly 200 souls. November 21st, 1777, about the time of Thanksgiving, my comrade William was deployed to spend the holidays with his kin in New York City, while I dutifully stood guard over our town. At the stroke of 1 a.m., as I maintained my vigil, musket in hand, patrolling the entire township, I discerned a voice that was unmistakably that of my friend William, exclaiming, "Hey, Arnold, come and behold what I have discovered." This, however, puzzled me greatly, for William had ventured to New York City with his family. An eerie intuition suggested that something was amiss, as if his voice had been twisted or distorted in some unnatural manner. Summoning my resolve, I called out, "William, where are you?" Yet there was no reply. Then, from behind me, a response emerged, and it sent shivers down my spine. "I am right here," came the retort, and as I turned to face it, I beheld a grotesque and inhuman figure. Standing at a towering 9 feet in height, its emaciated visage appeared as if it had suffered from relentless hunger, and its form lacked the attributes of humanity, including any semblance of genitals. Swiftly, I discharged my musket, aiming squarely at its abdomen, eliciting from it a shrill cry akin to that of a fox. In an astonishing display of speed, it vanished into the night, leaving me confounded and bewildered. I would not encounter it again until the passage of a full month, as I proceeded to a nearby shop in proximity to the creature I had encountered. A scene of dreadful horror unfolded before my very eyes. There lay a deceased man, likely in the latter stages of his 50s, amidst a pool of sanguineous fluid. The sight was indeed a gruesome and ghastly spectacle to behold. Without delay, I swiftly mounted my trusty steed and embarked upon a journey to New York City, with the intent to apprise my friend William of the dire events that had befallen. November 22nd, 1777, I arrived in New York City and reunited with my friend William. He inquired as to the purpose of my journey alongside him, and I proceeded to recount the entirety of the unsettling events. Following my account, his countenance took on a spectral pallor, and he hastily concluded his repast. Together, we set forth, making our way back to the environs of upstate New York, with the solemn intent of launching an investigation. November 24th, 1777, William and I returned to the small town as the clock struck 4 in the afternoon. The atmosphere was chill, and a serene calm enveloped the surroundings. I chanced upon a woman and inquired if she had ever laid eyes on a creature of extraordinary stature, one that reached 9 feet in height. Her response was in the negative. Thereupon, I recounted the entirety of the unsettling narrative to her, and she found herself overtaken by a sense of dread. She kindly extended an invitation for us to lodge at her dwelling for the night. Later, William and I revisited the shop, where we encountered its proprietor. I queried if he had encountered the enigmatic entity, and to my disquiet, he responded with laughter. My emotions oscillated between agitation and exasperation. Notably, the blood stains that had once marred the floor were conspicuously absent, as if no vestige of a body had ever occupied that space. In the evening hours, I took up residence in the woman's abode. While William slumbered soundly, I gazed out into the wooded expanse through the window pane. My ruminations remained captive to the troubling events that had transpired. Sleep eluded me, the incident persistently occupying my thoughts. It was during this nocturnal vigil that I engaged in conversation with the woman, whose countenance possessed a captivating charm, her chestnut tresses framing a visage that bespoke youthfulness in her early 20s. We exchanged introductions, and our affections bloomed. December 20th, 1777, William and I journeyed to Valley Forge with the purpose of receiving military instruction under the tutelage of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian military officer of notable repute. Under his guidance, we embarked upon rigorous training regimens encompassing the proper use of the bayonet, the precision of marching in formation, and the swift execution of orders. The toil was relentless, and I found myself beset by fatigue, akin to the weariness that befalls those toiling in the fields, such as slaves laboring under the unrelenting sun, gathering rice or tending to tobacco. To rejuvenate our spirits, we sought repose in distinct quarters, each of us retreating to our respective lodgings. Thereafter, we would reassemble for further sessions of training. December 27, 1777, sometime around 5 a.m., I awoke to the urgent voice of William, summoning me to venture outside, for he professed that my beloved had arrived at Valley Forge. Yielding to his plea, I consented, and as I cautiously unfastened the door, the world outside lay silent, the rest of our comrades in deep slumber. Surveying the surroundings, my gaze fell upon William, who stood alone in the dimness. However, conspicuously absent was my girlfriend, and a disconcerting revelation coursed through me. This was the very creature I had encountered just 1 month prior. Gripping my bayonet tightly, I inched the door shut, wary of what lurked beyond. A span of 10 anxious minutes elapsed, devoid of any sound but for a distorted and unnerving bark. I steadfastly resisted the impulse to reopen the door, all the while gripped by an escalating sense of dread and fear. January 8, 1778, William confided in me about a disquieting incident that occurred during the night. Some 12 days hence, as he lay in slumber, the creature materialized outside his window, although on this occasion, it refrained from assuming the guise of a beast. In an attempt to dispel the dread that had settled upon him, William feigned slumber, striving to convince himself that the encounter had been naught but a disturbing dream. The disconcerting nature of the occurrence left both of us in a state of profound trepidation. We find ourselves confronted with a vexing dilemma. Should we elevate this matter to the high command for their counsel and intervention? January 20th, 1778, William and I conveyed the disconcerting news to General John, who expressed a commitment to conduct a thorough investigation in the town we had staunchly defended in upstate New York. Laden with provisions of sustenance and potable water, we made our way to the settlement, only to find it draped in an eerie stillness. As night descended, William, General John, and myself embarked on a collective patrol of the desolate town. We had intended to rendezvous with the store owner, who had previously scorned my account, but he had inexplicably vanished without a trace. Encountering the woman with whom I had shared my time, her visage now etched with deep anxiety, she inquired about my whereabouts during my absence. I apprised her of my sojourn in Valley Forge. She confided that the store owner's inexplicable disappearance had left her with grave reservations, and she harbored doubts as to whether the same malevolent entity that had claimed the life of the elderly man 2 months prior was responsible. Remarkably, she bore the news of her pregnancy. Recognizing the need to offer solace and security in such uncertain times, I extended an invitation for her to accompany us to Valley Forge, where she might find respite and refuge. Without hesitation, we ushered her to the sanctuary of Valley Forge, a haven where she could seek rest and reassurance. January 23, 1778, upon our return, the conspicuous absence of General John confounded us. He was nowhere to be discerned. Inquiries amongst the inhabitants yielded a disconcerting account, for they recounted observing him engaged in discourse with an unseen interlocutor amidst the woodlands, his steps leading him deeper into the shrouded forest. We embarked on a steadfast journey through the woodland, our voices raised in a clarion call for General John. Along this course, we happened upon a cave, its interior steeped in inky darkness. Kindling our lanterns, we pierced the gloom with their luminance. There, within the cavern's recesses, a chilling tableau unfurled before our very eyes. Scores of human remains lay strewn about, reduced to naught but skeletal vestiges. Amongst the macabre assemblage, a bloodied handprint, etched with the ominous proclamation, "Arnold and William are next," leapt out to assail our senses. A portentous conviction overcame us, and William voiced it with urgency. "We must evacuate this dread-filled abyss," he declared. Swiftly mounting our steeds, we departed from the site of the dire discovery, retracing our path until we were safely ensconced within the confines of Valley Forge. January 25, 1778, upon our return, we conveyed the harrowing chronicle to George Washington, the laughter upon his countenance serving as an unwelcome reception. He chided us, deeming our belief in the realm of the supernatural or apparitions to be a folly of the highest order. A wave of indignation surged within us, for our assertion rang true, yet his credulity was beyond our grasp. It was then that we learned of his intent to enact our discharge, the designated date set for March 15, 1778. As the sands of time dwindled within the hourglass of our service, we found ourselves endowed with an abundance of leisure. 2 a.m. January 26, 1778, we chanced upon an entity that bore the semblance of a deer. Yet as its gaze fell upon us, the creature affixed its eyes upon ours, an unsettling communion that endured for an indeterminate span. In an abrupt and astonishing metamorphosis, the creature swelled in stature, launching an onslaught upon our steeds. By some providential grace, our horses withstood the assault, emerging from the fray with their lives and limbs intact. Yet, the enigmatic entity persevered, doggedly tailing our every step. We find ourselves in close proximity to the border of New York, to say the least. January 29, 1778, we tarried in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, seeking reprieve for a solitary night's rest. To the townsfolk, we divulged the fullness of our tale. Amongst them, a man by the name of Joseph, seasoned by service in the French and Indian War, emerged as a source of wisdom on matters of lore and legend. Joseph beckoned me into his cabin, nestled amidst the sylvan outskirts of Williamsport. Here, in the quietude of his abode, he arranged a parley betwixt myself and the Native Americans, whom he identified as Ojibwe Indians. Remarkably, Joseph possessed the gift of translating my words into their tongue, and their responses into English. It was amid these exchanges that they imparted to me the name of the malevolent entity we had encountered, a Wendigo, by their reckoning. The Indians conveyed that the slaying of a Wendigo availed two methods: a well-aimed shot to the heart, or the infliction of death through fire. William and I, burdened by the capriciousness of our marksmanship, elected the latter course of action, consigning the creature to the cleansing embrace of flames. February 15, 1778 to February 16, 1778, I returned to Valley Forge and imparted to my beloved the course of action I had charted. Her countenance radiated with enthusiasm, bidding me farewell with a heartfelt good luck. On the ensuing day, William and I labored to fashion torches, a strategy to confront the elusive entity should we encounter it anew. As fate would have it, our paths once more converged with Joseph. He pledged to dispatch a cadre of Native Americans to accompany our mission, their purpose to aid in the relentless pursuit of the Wendigos. And this, dear friend, brings me to the most cherished segment of our narrative. March 1st, 1778, sometime around the 7th hour of morn, I was stirred from slumber by a familiar symphony of barks, hearkening back to those eerie echoes of 4 months prior. With stealthy resolve, I roused the Native Americans, Joseph and William, from their repose. Swiftly, we readied ourselves, seizing hold of our trusty torches, resolute in our intent. In relentless pursuit, we embarked upon the chase, hot on the trail of the elusive Wendigo. As the creature materialized before our eyes, we hurled our flaming implements in unison, igniting a chorus of anguished cries that reverberated through the air, threatening to rupture the very confines of my eardrums. Then, in a surreal tableau, I bore witness to the gradual dissolution of the Wendigo's corporeal form, vanquished by the searing blaze. Profound gratitude welled within me, a sentiment I readily extended to Joseph and the Native Americans for their invaluable tutelage in the art of the Wendigo's demise. March 10, 1778, subsequent to the departure of the Native Americans, accompanied by Joseph, William and I made our way to the township in upstate New York. Venturing into the wooded expanse, the very locale where General John's presence had last been witnessed, I espied a recently excavated depression in the earth. Drawing nearer, our grim discovery unveiled itself. The lifeless form of General John lay supine within the pit. The spectacle that met our gaze was one of unimaginable horror, a testament to the inhuman brutality inflicted upon him by the Wendigo prior to our triumph over the loathsome creature. March 15, 1778, we received our honorable discharges and were dispatched to our respective homes. I journeyed back to the heart of Massachusetts, where I sought to unburden my soul by recounting the harrowing chronicles of my service to my family. Meanwhile, it grieves me to relate that William's sojourn in the urban labyrinth of New York City had taken a grievous toll upon his sanity. He was committed to a wretched institution for the infirm of mind, a place where tales of mistreatment at the hands of the attending physicians weighed heavily upon my conscience. The plight of my dear friend weighed heavily upon my heart, and I harbored a profound sense of sorrow on his behalf. In the year 1786, I undertook a poignant visitation, an opportunity to commune with William for the final occasion. It was a melancholic farewell, for in the year 1788, he departed this realm, his tormented spirit released from the bonds of earthly suffering. For those who may peruse these words, I commit them to paper on this day, the 4th of October, in the year 1822. A span of 44 years has elapsed since the nightmarish ordeal befell me. The specter of those dire events still haunts my thoughts, a disquieting presence that time has failed to diminish. I must extend my profound gratitude to Joseph and the Native Americans whose valor led to the demise of the creature. Yet, even as I draw solace from their triumph, I cannot fully quell the apprehension that one day, the malevolent entity may rise once more from the abyss. Alas, I am compelled to acknowledge that my days are numbered, for infirmity has taken hold, and my journey upon this mortal coil nears its conclusion. The prospect of bearing witness to any potential resurrection of the fiend is beyond my grasp, as I stand on the precipice of my own impending demise. Furthermore, in August of the year 1778, my son entered this world, a joyous arrival that transpired shortly after the calamitous incident we had weathered. Regrettably, the fates conspired to keep us apart for countless decades, a prolonged separation that weighed heavily upon my heart. As time unfurled its tapestry, I received tidings that my son had embarked upon his own journey, entering into the sacred bonds of matrimony and siring offspring. His valor was tested in the crucible of the War of 1812, a conflict that further etched the indelible mark of service upon our family legacy. Yet, in the year 1814, the specter of sorrow descended upon me once more, as my cherished wife departed this earthly realm. Her absence leaves an irreplaceable void, and in the present moment, as I inscribe these lines, my eyes are awash with tears, for the ache of her absence lingers evermore. There you go. This has been in my memory for 30 years. My grandfather is at the ripe old age of 102. I still think about how brave my fourth great-grandfather and his comrade killing the Wendigo. Fifth story. My girlfriend took me camping. I just want to start by saying that dating is hard. Once you get past all the bots, ads, and scammers and meet a real person, the guessing game begins. Why is this person actually available right now? Are they really just down on their luck? Or is it something else that you're happier not knowing? Then, once you figure out their deep dark secrets, the question becomes, are they willing to put up with your deep dark secrets? This process can take weeks to sort out, usually resulting in a dead end somewhere, forcing you to start over. The whole thing is frustrating, demeaning, and humiliating enough that you're physically and emotionally exhausted, making you just want to give up and be a loner. Now I know what you're wondering. What's this got to do with anything? Well, it's kinda simple. A little bit ago, I wrote about how my girlfriend, Wendy, never eats and that I heard some unsettling things at her house the last time I visited. Well, I decided to keep seeing Wendy. Sure, she might have some unusual habits, but she makes me feel good about myself, and I'm happy with her. So what if she never eats or chases off bears while nude in the middle of the night? Compared to returning to the dating scene, that's really not so bad. We even have nicknames for each other now, Country Girl and City Boy. I'll let you guess which is which. Anyway, that's a rather long and roundabout way of saying that. Yeah, I went on that camping trip with her, and things didn't go quite how I expected. First off, I want to say that she was right. The forest really is beautiful. The sun's heat, combined with the coolness of the shade, while listening to the insects drone lazily in the background, seems to slow time to a crawl, making each breath a relaxing experience in and of itself. It's entirely unlike anything you'll experience during your morning commute. Combine all that with the right company, and soon you'll wonder why you'd ever return. And let me tell you, Wendy is 100% the right company. Wendy was quick with tips to make the hike easier, from how to properly distribute your pack load to how to lace your shoes for maximum comfort. During the trek to where we were going to set up camp, she alternated between offering interesting bits of information about the local flora and fauna and walking in silence, allowing me to get lost in the experience. The whole affair made me want to give up the city life and move to the country. There was just one thing during the walk that wasn't as pleasant as everything else. At one point, we must have walked too close to a skunk or a rotting carcass or something because the whole area around us started to reek. At first, it wasn't so bad, but eventually, it got so strong it made me want to gag. I jokingly mentioned it to Wendy, but she just looked ahead like she was determined and told me, "Pick up the pace. We'll be past it soon enough." Sure enough, we eventually got past the smell, and things quickly became pleasant again. The rest of the hike passed without incident, and Wendy even helped me set up the tent. Her evident experience in the matter showed through because it took no time. Soon enough, everything was ready, and we even had a nice, cheerful fire roaring. This time, when she pulled out the supplies for dinner, it didn't even bat an eye when it was clearly only enough for one. Whatever was going on with her, this was just the way it was going to be. It was up to me to accept that or move on, and I'd made my call. But I have to say, for someone who never seems to eat, she sure knows how to sear a steak to perfection. After a pleasant evening and an even more pleasant night, we passed out in the tent together while listening to the crickets and the more distant owls. But of course, if that's all that happened, I wouldn't be writing about it here. Sometime during the night, I awoke to find I was alone in the tent. This wasn't too unexpected because Wendy was both an outdoor enthusiast and a bit of a night owl. I debated calling out to her, but something in the air felt like I shouldn't disturb it with such an out-of-place sound. However, Mother Nature did have her demands, and it was time to answer her call. As I unzipped the tent and stepped out, I couldn't help but look up into the night sky. The stars were breathtaking. You never see this many this vibrant in the city. However, their beauty couldn't distract me for long in the face of more urgent demands. Do you know that feeling when you've been holding it in a little too long and finally experience relief? If it weren't for my experiences earlier that night, I might be tempted to claim it is better than sex, but we'll just say it was still pretty euphoric. Maybe it distracted me from the fact that all the usual night sounds had suddenly gone quiet, but it couldn't distract me from the sudden smell of rotting flesh. It was even stronger than it had been on the trail and was accompanied by the kind of fear that you usually feel when you're very young and just starting to wonder if there might be reasons sounds go bump in the night. I gagged as I struggled to cut off the stream, zip up my pants, and retreat into the tent again. Once in the tent, I reached for the flashlight, then hesitated. I desperately wanted to see better, but something in the back of my mind told me it was better to remain hidden. Of course, I don't know how well hidden a blue tent in the middle of the forest can be, but turning on a flashlight would be like activating a beacon for everything within a few miles to see. I sat in the dark for I don't know how long, feeling my heart pound through my chest loud enough that I was sure whatever was out there could hear it clearly. Thankfully, the smell eventually faded, but I was still so high on adrenaline that I knew I wouldn't sleep another wink for the rest of the night. Or so I thought. The following day, I awoke with Wendy cuddled in my arm, with one of her legs and arms draped over me, and once again, she was totally nude. Now, I was pretty sure she'd put on some pajamas before going to bed, but as she stirred and I got a good look at what was on display, I suddenly didn't care all that much. Eventually, she smiled lazily up at me and spoke. "You sleep all right, city boy? You seem to have some pretty rough dreams in the middle of the night." At the time, those words made perfect sense. In the light of day, It seemed pretty clear that whatever happened last night was probably just a vivid dream brought on by the experiences of the day before and an unfamiliar environment. After a bit more time together, we decided to get up and tackle another day in the forest. However, when I finally crawled out of the tent, I could see our entire camp was in disarray. It was like something had gone through and tossed everything around. A few of the more delicate items were totally demolished. After a moment, I called out, hey, you might want to take a look at this." As Wendy crawled out of the tent, she made a face. Must have been a bear. They usually don't come out this way, so I wasn't too worried about them. "I guess that's on me, sorry." A bear, that kind of made sense. At least, I told myself so. As we were cleaning up, I even saw tracks, though, in my inexperience as a city boy, I would have said they belonged to a dog, not a bear. A huge dog. Maybe a wolf? What was even odder was when I found what looked like hoof prints. Looking at the prints, I realized that deer must be much bigger than they look on TV since they were more than twice as long as my hand. There isn't much more to say about the day. We fixed the place up, had breakfast, went on a hike, made dinner, and called it a night, with a few other minor activities sprinkled throughout. I was back to enjoying the trip, so much so that I had mostly forgotten about the night before. But that night is when things took a bit of an unexpected turn. Once again, I awoke in the middle of the night. Thankfully, I wasn't alone this time, as Wendy was still asleep, half on top of me again. However, that stench was back and stronger than ever. It was amazing how bright it seemed in the tent. It must have been a full moon, or at least nearly full, because I could clearly see the shadow of a large deer pass between us and the night sky. But there was something wrong with this deer. It was clearly too tall, as if it was standing on hind legs, and when it opened its mouth, I could even make out a mouthful of very sharp teeth. I couldn't help it. I felt myself breathing more heavily by the second as my heart rate skyrocketed. My mind went blank when I suddenly felt Wendy stir. Remembering the presence of my considerably smaller girlfriend, I suddenly felt protective, as if I couldn't let anything happen to her. I was just about to tell her to be quiet when I noticed her looking up at me with a finger on her lips, as if telling me to do the same. Then she whispered to me, "Stay in the tent," and started to get up. I don't know what I was thinking or if I was thinking. All I knew was I couldn't let Wendy go out to face whatever that was. So I reached out and grabbed her wrist before she could exit the tent. However, when she looked back at me, I released her immediately, almost as scared of her as whatever was outside the tent. Her eyes reflected light back at me like a cat's, and I could see the nails on her hand growing as I watched. In half a moment, she turned back around, opened the tent, and climbed outside. I will never forget the sound I heard at that moment. After I got home, I looked up the calls of a bunch of wild animals, and in hindsight, I'd say it was like a compilation of an elk call, a rabbit scream, and a mountain lion scream, but impossibly loud. Wendy shouted in answer, her tiny human voice sounding so frail in comparison. At least it did until it started to change, morphing and twisting into the howl of an impossibly large wolf. I couldn't help it. I peeked out the tent flap, and standing in front of the tent was what I could only describe as a werewolf. The little 5 foot and change Wendy was now standing at least 7 feet tall, covered in fur with claws and fangs that looked like they could tear through steel, and she looked ready for murder. Then, some movement on the opposite end of our camp drew my attention, and I witnessed a living nightmare that suddenly made a werewolf seem like less of a problem. It looked kind of like a deer if a deer had more articulated limbs far too long for its body. The feet ended in hooves, but the hands ended in long bony claws. The whole thing looked desiccated, its skin drawn so tight over its ribs and arms you could make out the skeleton beneath. The fur was spotty and looked partially rotted, with open holes leaking bodily fluids that should never see light. Its teeth were long and serrated, clearly meant for tearing rather than chewing. I sometimes hear hunters talking about deer being 8 or 10 points, but if I had to estimate, this thing had a 30-point antler, with many of the tines covered in what I suspected to be dried viscera from previous victims. The two monsters charged each other. The nightmare, which I now know was a Wendigo, lowered its head, intending to impale its opponent, but at the last second, Wendy threw herself nearly flat on the ground, only to rocket up into the Wendigo, latching onto its long neck with her powerful jaws while her hind feet kicked gouges into its vulnerable stomach. However, the Wendigo didn't seem willing to give up that easily and tossed Wendy aside. She hit the ground hard and was soon set upon by the other monster. She raised an arm to defend herself, only for the Wendigo to latch on with its own teeth, easily tearing through her skin and muscles. With a powerful kick, Wendy pushed the nightmare back, then started swiping at him over and over, making it lose ground. However, lowering its head, the Wendigo charged forward again, and this time, Wendy wasn't fast enough as the Wendigo caught her on his antlers and flipped her over his back, with new blood darkening the tips of the tines. But that was its downfall as Wendy sprung up and again latched onto its neck with her teeth, this time from behind. The nightmare struggled in vain, occasionally raking Wendy with his claws, but she refused to let go and began ripping and tearing her way through its neck until she grabbed hold of its antlers, and with one final jerk, the head came free. I don't have the heart to describe what came next, but let's just say the sound of flesh being torn and eaten is much more distinct through the thin membrane of a tent than a closed cabin window. Time passed. At least an hour, maybe 2 or 3. It's hard to say for sure. I don't know what I expected to happen next. Maybe I was going to be next, or perhaps I'd wake up from this nightmare, but eventually the adrenaline passed. My eyes grew heavy, and I fell asleep again. When I awoke in the morning, I was alone this time. There was no sign Wendy had come back. I'd half hoped she'd still be here, telling me I'd had another nightmare, but I don't think I would have believed it again. It was kind of sad and lonely packing up our things by myself. I debated bringing Wendy's stuff with me, but I'm not that good of a hiker and wasn't confident I could pull it off, so I just left her things in her pack inside the tent. When I exited the tent, I was more than a little surprised to see Wendy sitting calmly by the fire pit with no wounds in sight. She smiled sadly. "So, I guess I owe you an explanation." I remember hesitating, my mind blank, before I settled on the thought I had earlier. "What? You're not going to try and convince me it was a nightmare again?" She looked around at all the destruction in the campsite. Earth was kicked up, trees had claw marks gouged out, and there were signs of blood splatter everywhere. "I didn't think I could convince you this time." I nodded as I looked around. "Yeah, I guess not." Then, I looked back at her. "You know, for a bit there, I was starting to think you were the monster eating people out here." Wendy pointed at herself, then laughed. "Wait, me? Wendy the Wendigo? Don't you think that's a little too on the nose?" I couldn't help it. As weird and messed up as everything was, as disturbing as everything I learned was, this was the Wendy I knew and cared for. So, I laughed with her. "Yeah, maybe so. Long story short, we're still together. Sure, my girlfriend might be a 7-foot-tall monster that eats other monsters for fun, but everyone has their quirks. Besides, dating is hard, and I'm happy where I am." Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.